Not all elves are equal. There are about 7 different clans or sub-derivations of elves, and today I am going to be ranking them according to my opinion, really. And this is meant to be a bit of a follow-up to last week's video where I went over the great journey of the elves. So if you're interested in that, then consider watching that. So if you've got any ideas yourself, then feel free to pop them down in the comment section down below, and I could be making a video on that very subject very soon, who knows. Of course, there are 3 main clans of the Eldar as a whole, although then there's 4 of the Quendi, then, you know, with the Avari as well. But as I said, there's 7 that we're going to be talking about today, so if I just go over the list of those which are included, those are the Avari, Falmari, Sindar, Silvan, Lyquendi, Vanyar and the Noldor. The system that I'm going to be using for the ranking system is going to be quite a prevalent one in the gaming spheres as a whole, and so the very top tier, those are going to be the S tier, and the one below that is the A tier, B tier, C tier, and then the D tier. Yeah. I can do the alphabet, I promise. So D tier is going to be the very bottom rung. So I'm going to put each of these clans into one of these tiers, and I'm going to give my opinion as to why they should fit into that tier. And I'm trying to look at the clan as a whole rather than just seeing how good they are in battle or in a war or something like that, because some of these clans definitely will have more written about them than others. Well, let's go alphabetically. So we shall begin with the Avari. They were the refusers, and they refused to go on the great journey from Cuivinen. They stayed there, and these guys were basically the cynics, the conspiracy theorists, and they did not go to Amman. Therefore, they lost out completely on all that knowledge and craftsmanship that they could have gained from being taught by the Valar. Of course, they knew how the world was shaped, so they missed out on quite a lot. They were the quintessential Moriquendi, or the Dark Elves, and they were as far away as possible from the light of the 2 trees. And for this reason, I put them at the very bottom of the pile, in the D tier. They refused going to the Blessed Realm to just rub sticks together by the lake. So yeah, that's just really stupid, isn't it? Our next port of call, if you pardon the pun, are the seafaring Telleri of Alway, and they were known as the Falmari. Now, the Falmari, they weren't anything like a warlike nation or anything like that. They were just really good shipbuilders, and they were taught by the very best, and they made them in the shape of a swan. Now, also interestingly, they valued silver above like gold and precious metals such as that, just because it, you know, fit the aesthetic, I suppose. And they were the last ones to be ferried across on Telleri during the Great Journey. And they actually ended up just staying on Telleri because they loved the sea so much. But there was the Kalakiria, there's like a bit of a gap in the Pelori, which shielded Amman from the outside world. So there was actually the light of the 2 trees just shining through there upon the lonely isle. And because of this, they are still Calaquendi, and, you know, they get all the benefits that come with that, and they are ginormous. And, you know, they still got their teachings from the Valar, and they were far, far more knowledgeable than those below them. There's not a whole lot you can really say about them. Not much is known about them other than the fact that they famously got killed by the Noldor en masse during the first kinslaying at Alcolonde, and all they had were bows and such, whereas the Noldor had actual weapons of war. So they massively missed out there, and because of that then, during the War of Wrath at the end of the First Age, all that they would do to supply or help the hosts of the West was just to sail them across the sea to Middle-earth. So it's kind of difficult to place them in somewhere within our tier list, but just due to the fact that they are Calaquendi, I would still put them above others and put them at a solid B. I think that the technological advancements that the Falmari had, even over the Noldor, i.e. the boats, is pretty substantial, and boats were very much required for the Noldor when they went back to Middle-earth during their rebellion. So I could put them higher, but this is just one of those, like, you could put them as A, I suppose, but we just don't know all that much about them. They're more of a peaceful nation, and I'd say they've got more in common with some of these nations, or clans rather, that we'll have later on in the list. And speaking of one of those clans are the Lyquendi, the Green Elves, and these were Telleri that during the Great Journey they split off from the main hosts once they reached the Misty Mountains, and they decided to go south down the River Anduin, and they'd eventually work their way to Beleriand. They'd go like through the gap of what would later be known as the Gap of Rohan, and make their way into Beleriand and settle in the land of the Seven Rivers, or Osiriand. Now, these guys, not a whole lot is said of them either, other than the fact that during the Years of the Trees, just before the coming of the Noldor, they helped out the Sindar elves of Doriath, and they went into a battle and they got absolutely massacred. Like, their leader, their king, they got killed, and they got beaten so heavily that they never came to war again. And they were rather reclusive, just in the, in the lands of the rivers, in the trees. They were just the forest people after that. So I'd say that they're very similar to the Sylvan Elves that are known in Mirkwood and places like that, but I've kind of separated them because I think there's enough difference between the two, because one is pretty much only spoken about in the Silmarillion, whereas the other one is more focused on The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings a little bit, so I thought I'd just add them in here. So this folk, they weren't particularly advanced. Now, they did get a little bit closer to the light of the trees. That does raise them a little bit high in that regard. And then they did have open trade and, communication with the Grey Elves of Doriath in particular. So, some of that would have brushed off on them, I think. But certainly, you look at this first battle of Beleriand against the Orcs and how they got so utterly wrecked that it's very difficult to put them very high up on this list. And for that reason, I'm going to put them as a C. Just like all elves, really, they're going to be very good at, singing and dancing and all that. But when it comes to actually making things, like crafting things or magic, they're not very high up, but they're still going to be better than the Avari. So let's talk about the most storied clan, and they are the Noldor. Now, you can probably guess where I'm going to put these guys, but they were the first, among others, to make it to Aman at the end of their great journey, and so they were fully benefiting from the light of the two trees, and also they were there for thousands of years, and they were really keen learners. And someone like Galadriel, she learnt all that there was to learn from the Valar, but particularly from the Valar Aule, many, such as Fëanor, really learnt how to craft a very nice selection of things, such as the Silmarils. So nice, in fact, that they went and waged war upon another continent against basically the most powerful being in Arda. Now, this knowledge, I probably should have also mentioned, is probably something that you or I would also call magic. It's just knowledge that is so in depth of everything that, of the world, that you can't really explain it to a mortal or a short-lived member, or a member of a short-lived race, because it would just be like, oh, it's magic. But these elves, they certainly had that in abundance, and they were also very good in war, very good in battle, resilient in defeat as well, despite the fact that during the first stage they suffered some very heavy defeats. They were still knocking around until the very end. And well, they did actually win a few battles as well during that time, so it's not all doom and gloom. But the Silmarillion definitely was just which Noldorin house it gets killed off now. Although even just a regular Noldor elf is going to be eons ahead of, say, an Avari elf. So for that reason as well, I'm going to pop them as at the S tier. They are the best. They're the best. The Sylvan Elves, they're quite similar to the Lyquendi, and these guys, they also have other names. They're called like Nandor, or those who turned back, and they are also of Tellerin descent. Now these guys, they turned back once they made it to the Misty Mountains, essentially, or to the Anduin River. But rather than going down the River Anduin, they just stayed in the forests that were around there. So Mirkwood or Erungallen and Lothlorien. Now, they're not really spoken about in the First or Second Ages, really. It's mostly in the Third Age. But even at the end of the Second Age, during the War of the Last Alliance, they are noted to be less well armoured, and obviously they're not going to be as good at crafting as the Noldorin elves of the West. So that kind of carries on into the Third Age as well. Now, of course, it is good to point out that there were some Sindar lords that came eastwards from Lindon following the end of the First Age, and these were Orother, Thranduil, and then you had Amroth and Amdir as well, and also Celeborn. But these guys basically were taken as lords because they were seen by the Sylvan Elves as being, much more powerful than they were, and so they were like, hey, do you want to be our kings and whatnot? And they were like, sure. Now, they did slightly improve the society in some fashion, presumably giving them some good quality leadership from, and teaching those below them of what they had learned in Doriath, for instance. But there were very, very few of them. They're not going to transform the whole realm just because they've got some really good leadership. So as a whole, the Sylvan Elves, they're not all that powerful. But having said that, those in Lothlorien, for instance, they held off Sauron's attacks from Dol Guldur and eventually then pressed forward and dispatched and destroyed all of Dol Guldur. And those in Mirkwood as well, up in Thranduil's halls, they were able to hold off the attack of Sauron's forces up there as well during the War of the Ring and, not get wiped out. So in terms of war, they're certainly better than just Lyquendi, but I think overall, I struggle to put them any higher than Lyquendi, but I would put them as a B or a C tier, although, whatever, that's fine. Moving on then, we get the Sindar, and they were also of Tellerin origin. These were the ones that would miss the boat of Tol Eressëa over the sea because they didn't want to leave their king Elwë stranded because they were still looking for him because he'd gone missing. Now Elwë would become known as Elu Thingol or just Thingol, and he would be the king of Doriath, or pretty much of all Beleriand. And he was actually a Calaquendi because he was one of those that was chosen as an ambassador to go to Valinor and then come back to Cuiviénen and then be like, yeah, guys, we should go on the great journey. So he definitely had seen the light of the two trees. And his wife actually was a Maiar. So a Maiar is, at the very top of the tree, you've got like the gods and you've got the Ainur, and they are split into the Valar, and then you've got the Ainur below them. And other Maiar include Gandalf and the other wizards. So Melian was a Maiar, and she was the queen of that realm. And because of this, those elves that lived within the borders of Doriath definitely would have seen, it wouldn't have been like Aman or the Blessed Realm of Valinor, but it would have certainly been an echo of the grandeur of the West, similar to how Gondor and Arnor were to Númenor. Now, the Sindar also were called Grey Elves because they kind of had a twilight that kind of came from the light of the two trees over the sea. So they weren't completely in the dark, And as I say, the light of the two trees has a direct correlation to the power of an elf. If they like bathed in its light, that makes them suddenly like way better. Now, I know I talk a lot about the military might of some of these elf clans, but I think Sindar are probably the biggest influence on elven culture in Middle-earth. Now, this is because pretty much, even if you look at like Lord of the Rings, whenever they're speaking Elvish, they're pretty much always speaking in Sindarin, apart from the odd exclamation from Frodo, for instance, where he's like, I am Kalime, and all that. That would be Quenya. But by and large, the predominant language of the elves is Sindarin, and this is also what is spoken by nobles of the Dunedain line, so Gondor and up in Arnor. And this absolutely shows the power that Elur Thingol would have commanded in Beleriand during the First Age, because he outlawed Quenya when he heard of the kinslaying and all that. But I would put the Sindar elves very high up there. They're not as good as the Noldor, but they give a good run for their money, so I'm going to put them as an A tier. Sindar elves that you might know would be Thranduil, Celeborn, and well, Legolas as well. So just if you want to know. And then finally, we come to the Vanyar. The Vanyar were, just like the Noldor, they were the first to make it to Marn, and they didn't really leave there. They were really, into the light of the trees, though, and actually, they were so into it that they moved from their city that they shared with the Noldor just to set up a different city even closer to the two trees over in Marn. So, and they did not leave there apart from when there was the War of Wrath, and some of them, not all of them, their king didn't, but some of them then did sail over the sea to Middle-earth to fight Melkor, and then they returned back home. This kind of overdose to the light of the trees definitely would have, given them very exceptional power, shall we say. But they weren't quite the craftsmen that Noldor were said to have been. But, having said that, there were more Vanyar that then would have been over there, that would have been born during the light of the trees, because, none of them left for the rebellion, whereas a good chunk of the Noldor did leave for Middle-earth, and then, they died, so, the population dwindled a little bit there. But if you just got a regular Vanyar elf and a regular Noldorin elf, then, there's not really going to be a whole lot of difference in terms of their prowess or stature and things like that. I think it's mostly just, their cultural differences, where one is more likely to follow the crafts and one is, more likely to become a mouthpiece of the gods or something like that. Having said that, though, the Noldor, of course, did go to Middle-earth, and because of that, there was a bit of a fading of their power, and this was due to Morgoth's influence on all of Arda, which did not seep into Aman. Aman was untouched, but as soon as the Noldor went back to Middle-earth, they kind of lost some of that light of the two trees glow and power as time wore on, and that is what you see with the fading of the elves. So generally speaking, the Vanyar would have been, certainly by the Third Age, they would have, as a whole, as a collective, they would have been more powerful than the Noldor, because, they're all over in Aman, rather than being split. But there were some Vanyar that did actually come to Middle-earth, if you want to call it that. I mean, one of them was the wife of Turgon. She actually died crossing the Helcaraxe, which is basically like crossing over the North Pole, so she died. But the ones that I can think of, now Finrod Felagund's girlfriend essentially was a Vanyar, but she did not come over to Middle-earth. She stayed back in Aman. But Galadriel's grandmother was a Vanyar, and it's actually because of this you have some of the Vanyarin bloodlines in the Elves, and actually this comes all the way down to the line of kings for Númenor, and indeed Aragorn actually has some Vanyarin descent as well. And I think it's greater, like if you look at Elrond, he has more Vanyarin blood than Noldor. I did do the maths once, but I mean, it's not loads. I think it's like 1/16th, and yeah. That's not really the point of this video anyway. But anyway, I'm going to put Vanyar as S tier as well. So, you may have noticed that generally, if I just put up the list somewhere around here, generally speaking, those at the very top, they are those who made greater progress on the Great Journey. Because as I've said in a few of these explanations, the exposure to the light of the two trees has a direct correlation to the power of an elf. And, you know, some of these elves made it only half the way there. Some of them made it all the way. Some of them then even came back, but we're not really going to mess it up too much. So anyway, this is just my opinion. I'm sure I could have put some of these elsewhere. It's kind of all up for grabs because, like, you know, it's not all spoken about directly. But I'm very interested to see what some of you guys think of that. And for those of you that aren't that well versed in the lore, then I hope this has also opened your eyes a little bit and has been both educational and good value for entertainment. But anyway, if you have any ideas for next week's video, then do pop them in the comments. I'm not 100% decided on what to do just yet, but nonetheless, thank you very much for watching, and I'm going with Gandalf. Good day.